I think what the cloud is enabling us to do is to be able to say, in some cases, the tactical lift and shift of data, put it there so it's usable, and then we'll work in parallel on, making it more strategic at the same time. Does it cost you less money in the long run? I don't know, but I think what it does do is give you some strategic optionality, if you will, about, do I have to do everything strategically and move it in place? These days, the ability to scale up volume in the cloud, to be able to move data there in whatever form it's in, to use it, you can do that relatively inexpensively these days.
That's Jane Possell, CIO of CNA, and this is the future of insurance. This episode is brought to you by Medallia, the market leader in customer and employee experience. Their award-winning SaaS platform, Medallia Experience Cloud, makes all your other applications customer and employee aware. Medallia uses proprietary AI and machine learning to reveal predictive insights that drive powerful business actions and outcomes. Leading insurers like Prudential and Zurich use Medallia to reduce churn, turn detractors into promoters, create in-the-moment cross-sell and upsell opportunities, and drive revenue-impacting business decisions. Learn more at medallia.com.
Jane Possell, thanks for joining me again. This is maybe the 73rd time we've talked in the past 12 months. It feels like that, maybe. I feel like I'm always bothering you for some time to pick your brain, so thank you yet
Not
again.
at all. My pleasure.
I'm interested to hear from you on what we're talking about today for a number of reasons. One being, you play in the space that I just spent the last decade in. So the commercial lines, you play in the specialty lines. That's all near and dear to my heart. Nothing against personal lines, but I feel like there's so much conversation about that. I'm excited to just go back to, let's talk about commercial. So there's different dynamics at play because the lines are different. And some of them feel like personal lines and how they transact, but a lot of them don't. And the distribution's different, and the customers and their experience demands are different. What are some of the major things that you see thematically driving change or disruption or dynamic shifts going on in commercial lines today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right. A lot of the conversation, especially when you think about technology, tends to focus on personal lines. I would say one of the things that we've been watching is the consolidation of distribution players in general across the board. And then specifically, the piece of that with the technology bent that I've been watching with a lot of interest is what people think of as these insurance exchange platforms. So think of the Bold Penguins, the Insurons, those types of platforms. And it's been really fascinating because even in the last 6 to 12 months, right? Like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, they were entering in small commercial space and everybody rushed to get integrated with them, right?
Yeah.
Build the integration, make it as repeatable as possible, and get out in front as fast as you can. So in the small commercial space, looks a lot like personal lines, operates very, similarly. And so that I think was more logical.
Yeah.
It's been really fascinating is that in the last 12 to 18 months, you're watching a lot of acquisitions of those types of platforms, right? So Aon bought CoverWallet most recently, right? We've had, a carrier acquire Bold Penguin,
Yeah.
American Family. And then we're also watching some of the distribution players buying an innovation company that's known for building innovative solutions, ostensibly to build a platform for them to distribute their product differently. So it's several different angles, all really impacting, how are carriers going to play in that new world? And what do we have to be able to do from a technology integration, a process perspective, even a prospecting perspective? How does AI play into it? That sort of thing. So that's one of the areas that I've been watching with a lot of interest.
Yeah. It's, I'm thinking as you're saying that both of the covers are gone. CoverHound and CoverWallet both acquired. Bold Penguin was just acquired after making their own acquisition. Actually just had Chris Cheatham on. And I don't know when I'm releasing these episodes, so I should say just had him on, and maybe it's yet to come. I don't know yet. But, founder of Risk Genius that Bold Penguin bought, and then pretty soon after was acquired themselves by MFAM. There's another change going on is we've had these traditional AMS, agency management providers, agency management system providers for eons. And they've evolved and changed and added features and capabilities and all that kind of stuff. But then we have a new crop that's really pushing pretty hard right now to enable a new generation of technology sort of built on CRM quite often in those agencies, which is where a lot of this business is produced. So that's either already or soon to be generating another shift in what distribution looks like. Because you're
Absolutely.
enabling a totally different approach to just the management of your business than
Mhm.
agents have really ever had.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, right? Because AMS has been like the holy grail for, I don't know, 20
Yeah.
years. I mean, hey, I need this way to be able to gather all the information, have one standard way of communication. And I remember having, national agency meetings where the big, huge agencies were saying to some of the carriers, you guys should get together and figure this out because this data exchange shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah.
And, in the last 2 years, we've seen some really interesting players starting to come up in the middle saying, we'll solve this problem for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And, I think they actually have a pretty good shot at it after many failed attempts over the years.
Yeah. I was just saying to someone yesterday, Salesforce.com in 2019's ITC, so the last in-person one before COVID. I'm pretty sure, I could be off by a few square feet, but I think they had the biggest display and show floor space taken up of anyone. And they're not explicitly in insurance. I mean, they had an announcement with State Farm there, and obviously lots of folks in the industry use Salesforce as their CRM, but they don't have like a bespoke, hardcore, like, here's our insurance offering. So to me, it's kind of like, watch this space because, you get the biggest player in CRM clearly looking at the industry. You've got all these new things coming up that are CRM based. I think it's going to be very interesting the next few years. On that point, you're just making this other ways of looking at distribution, of bringing together the process of lead gen and production,
Mhm.
getting this business bound. Something has already, but is about to shift a lot more than what we've seen, I think. And I think it's been waiting for, yeah, probably 20 years to happen.
I totally agree. And it's an interesting timing, right? Because when you think about what a lot of carriers are investing in internally, 5 years ago, it was data lake and what is that going to
Yeah,
look like? And how do I get my data in the cloud? Well, the more carriers learn how to standardize and manage data inside their own organizations, these are natural extensions, right? Then what's that next connectivity out into all the ecosystems that I play in, whether
mm-hmm.
they're a claims ecosystem or a distribution ecosystem.
Right.
I also think the other topic that's come up a lot more, and it's beyond the theoretical at this point, is how is artificial intelligence going to play into that lead generation
Yeah.
space? Because now that some of the external data, I mean, for a long time, the external data on individuals was great, right? You could order an MVR, motor vehicle report, you could
Yeah.
get all that basic standard credit report, everything. But as soon as you get up to beyond a certain size on the business side, the data was sketchy at best. And
Yeah.
we've seen some really interesting players who have made a whole business model out of honing data that was really difficult to nail down. And now you can just buy it and actually integrate it directly within your applications. So the amount of data you have is interesting. You combine it with some of the internal standardization and wrangling that's gone on over the last
Yeah.
couple of years, and then you couple it with some of this external connectivity. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting point. And I do see, as I'm thinking about it, like in the startup space, there is a lot of focus on facilitating a different data environment for the commercial market, and not just the small stuff. Like, yes, lots for small, but what do we do as it gets bigger? And the less we have to ask for, it's a better customer experience, but it's also more valid. The data is more
Mhm.
likely to be accurate or a real read on the behavior and not just what they told us they were doing, which may or
Right.
may not be close.
Hmm.
But of
Yeah.
course, in a pandemic, it could change. What they were doing at the start when you wrote them as new, everything's different in the economy, and so they had to shift what they did.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think the other thing, so I mean, that's on the distribution end. The other thing
Yeah,
that I'm seeing that, all data related is, blockchain is starting to move beyond the theoretical conversations into some like actual use cases that I think are getting traction. And probably because the use cases I'm hearing the most about are all in the regulatory area. So, regulatory, we all have to report. It's not differentiating in any way. By and large, we're having to share the same type of data and information. So it was actually a really smart use case because you can get carriers to come together and say, if I could figure out a way to less expensively and more consistently just provide the data to the various agencies that need it, but I can retain control of it, which is one of the things blockchain lets me do. It actually is a great use case for getting some traction. Now, because personal lines tends to be easier because it's less data in general, and again, more consistent data. Those are some of the earliest use cases I'm seeing, but some real traction, I think, is going to start to happen as you get up into the commercial space. Probably again, starting with small commercial, but blockchain has kind of moved past. It was sort of lumped in with like quantum computing and some of those other, sort of buzzword things that were out there from well, I wonder if it's going to have a use case too. Maybe it actually finally has found its first.
Yeah, I think it was a technology in search of a problem for a number of years. It had a hashtag before it every time it was mentioned, but it kind of felt that way, right? It didn't feel like it was real. But in the past year, we have seen use cases. USAA and State Farm made their announcement that they're working together on subrogation through a distributed ledger, through blockchain, so that they're not, doing thousands of transactions a day in both directions that could have canceled out if we could just clear them once. So the only thing we ever heard about before was like marine certs. That was the original use case anyone talked about. And yeah, that exists, but what you're talking about is actual ways to smooth out some of the logistics and the operational pain that we have in the industry, rather than thinking about it as a customer-facing product per se. Like maybe that's a path, but there's so much more we can do with it. And I love your point about retain control, because I think that's a big part of the problem with any interoperability and movement of data is like, well, then what happens to it? What if you get to keep control of it?
That's right. Well, and in this day and age, right, with COVID, where, security, I mean, I spend more time in conversations and in the news articles every week looking at, breach after breach after breach.
Yeah.
I mean, how you secure that data, again, it's not sexy, but it's critical. And while, yes, regulatory reporting is a well-paved path, and I'm not suggesting it's necessarily like, some new security target, but I think we're seeing the sophistication in security breaches, outside of insurance, just broadly with COVID going through the roof.
Yeah.
So the more that a company can retain that control over your data, just it's one less thing to worry about.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You had mentioned something to me before about blockchain as an enabler of data and analytics and some of the advanced analytics going on. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that's not a use case I'd necessarily heard of before. But as you talked about, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I think about it, right, is, I mean, data, we've spent a lot of time, and I would say CNA is on a really interesting path around data and analytics capabilities. And it's not something that we share a lot publicly intentionally, because we do feel like it's starting to give us some really good competitive advantage. That said, we're not the only carrier. I think most of my friends at other carriers or other colleagues talk about what they're doing in that space. To me, blockchain becomes just a natural extension of that work in data and analytics, because blockchain requires a certain understanding of your data and this, being able to create nodes that allow you to share the data. And so it's a natural extension of the internal data and analytics that a lot of us are doing. I think the really far out there question is going to be, how does the continued rise of public cloud play into what we can do when we think about, blockchain and our own internal data analytics capabilities?
Tell me what you mean by that more.
Well, so I mean, blockchain is all about our ability to access each other's nodes, right? When we need
Yeah.
to. I mean, that's the control that I was talking about earlier. And the more that you have things in the public cloud, right, that enablement of those connectivities becomes very interesting. So,
Mm.
for example, a lot of the analytics companies that have more modern platforms are starting to offer them as a SaaS type platform,
Yep.
as an example. So we're spending time figuring out how do we connect our data lakes into those platforms to run them in a different cloud. Well,
Mm.
the more that we have that ability to get used to that interconnectivity of cloud to cloud, multi-cloud, whatever your environment is for a given carrier,
Yeah.
the easier it will be to actually enable blockchain type solutions.
It's interesting connecting the different cloud. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it makes a lot of sense. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it seems like we focus on enabling a particular solution that happens to be cloud based, and that's fine, and APIs can do that. But what if we're thinking about the wrong, silly word to use, but like the web? I feel like it's
Right.
2000 again, the World Wide Web, but the web of
Yeah.
all these clouds, right? Like, there's more power when we start connecting them and interconnecting them than just thinking of them as a multitude of discrete solutions that maybe our core system or the UX we built on top of all these pieces ties together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just in a discussion with several global CIOs earlier today, and someone said, it begs the question, when are we going to move from building solutions to putting them together? In other
Mm,
words, taking pieces from multiple places, and it's going to be much more about aggregation of capability versus,
yeah,
building a system or a solution like we would have thought of even, 10 years ago.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's what all these tools are enabling is
Hmm.
we can get the best piece at the right moment for it. But you have to think about cohesively how can we bring it all together so it actually is valuable as a whole and not just summing all the pieces up.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and then, to put the downer aside on all of it, of course, every
Yeah,
carrier out there has a whole pile of legacy applications that are, some of them as much as 20, 25, 30 years old. So I think for most modern CIOs that are sitting, especially in a commercial insurance carrier, you've got some really modern things that you're building and sort of looking at where's the industry going, and then trying to figure out how do you bring the rest of your infrastructure and your application landscape along
yeah,
into at least, directionally towards that sort of future forward view.
yeah. Is data migration an issue still, or are there solutions for that, or are people? I mean, as you talk to your peer group, are there people who are just saying, "Look, the old data is the old data, and we're gonna have to leave it where it is because trying to move it is gonna break us or keep us from moving forward."
I mean, is it solved? I wouldn't necessarily say it's solved, but I do think that there are more tactical solutions available that allow you to go faster.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I mean, a lot of companies right now are talking about, how much strategic data movement do we put into the cloud or into the cloud? For example, if I'm going to put something in the data lake, there's probably a lot of unwinding of that just to
Yeah,
democratize that data as much as I can. In other words, make it easily understandable by anyone inside of the company about what the heck it is, instead of having to find the person that knows, well, that's the aggregation of these five things divided by this other thing, right? Which
right.
is not an uncommon state for commercial
Yeah,
data to be in. But I think what the cloud is enabling us to do is to be able to say, in some cases, the tactical lift and shift of data, put it there so it's usable, and then we'll work in parallel on, making it more strategic at the same time.
yeah,
Does it cost you less money in the long run? I don't know, but I think what it does do is give you some strategic optionality, if you will, about, do I have to do everything strategically and move it in place? That's where we were 5 and 10 years ago. It's like, oh my
yeah,
gosh, we have to get the structure right. That's why everyone was so excited about data lakes when they came up, because it released you from some of that force on, heavy structure oriented conversations, and what you built for something isn't going to work for something else. These days, the ability to scale up volume in the cloud, to be able to move data there in whatever form it's in, to
Yeah.
use it, you can do that relatively inexpensively these days.
And then you can augment it with external sources and other tools and analytics that might make up for what you can't move over or what
Mm-hmm.
isn't cost effective to move over.
Right, exactly. And what it lets you do is deliver value through your analytics
Yeah.
while you're doing all that stuff. So it
Yeah.
used to be, right, you had to get everything into the new
You had to wait
store.
for the whole thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And when I think about, is it a non-issue? I don't know that it's a non-issue, but I feel like we have more options for how we approach it
Mm-hmm.
that get to business value in the market faster than we did
Mm-hmm.
before.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair way to put it. One of the things we talked about before, you used the term wagile or wagile, depending how Britishly you want to say it. Waterfall and agile, and that's the move to agile or agile. I I worked for Brits for 10 years, so I end up saying agile, and I don't know if that makes me weird in the U.S., but it can be an unlock. And having worked in a startup, like that speed to things and the iteration and the way that you keep releasing. I mentioned in my next book, these startup carriers, one of them releases a new rating model every 2 days. And that was like, unheard of in an old world.
Hmm.
So while that's a nice place to be and a lot of people talk about it and try to move there or say they've moved there, it's not always the reality when you actually see how releasing has worked. And you've been through some of that transition. I'm wondering just some thoughts, from the coal face of what it's like to move into being more agile and maybe some tips or tricks or things to avoid.
Sure. I think one of them is thinking about why you're doing it and using that to guide how you do it. When I went through this the first time, I had a CIO that I worked for who, had amazing business relationships, and they trusted him to say, okay, sure, we're going to try this agile thing. But I think a big challenge for a lot of companies, it's like, well, the business doesn't understand why they should care. And if the
Yeah.
promise is just faster, that's usually oh, okay, great. But the business agility is so much more than speed,
Yeah.
pure, delivering solution A this way or solution A that way. It's about the responsiveness, right? It's about the business agility aspect of it. And so I think a lot of companies make the mistake of saying, oh, we're going to implement agile. And they think about it as a delivery
Yeah.
methodology. And I when I came to CNA, I lots of teams were using agile, but the leadership had not made a decision yet to take the waterfall handcuffs off. Right, we were
Yeah.
still locking people down in terms of scope and schedule and budget and all those other things. And then I'm asking them to be agile on the inside. That's that wagile or
Yeah.
wagile. But we took an area where we were struggling with what we needed to do, and I'll just make it very real. And I think it's something that I've seen a lot of different carriers. We had 4 or 5 different applications that they're older, they needed to be revamped and rewritten, and the business leader who was championing all this just kept saying, but we have to do that to be easy to do business with. And it's
Mm.
the age old, if you build it, they will come kind of a model that can be challenging, right? And every time, someone said we need to rebuild something, I went, okay, great, let's go do that. We took a look at what it would cost. The team would come back and say it's going to be $20 million to do it. And someone said, I don't want to do it. So technology was frustrated because it was, the no, not that mentality. The business was
Right.
frustrated because they felt like they couldn't get anything moved forward, and the market was moving on. And all of this was still kind of churning. And so, finding an area like that where we could say, let's stop talking about what you want us to do and let's start talking about what you're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the outcomes that you want? And using the outcomes to anchor how much investment do we think is appropriate in those outcomes? And then let's actually see how far we can get with the investment that we have. And we know we're laser focused on these particular outcomes versus laser focused on replacing system X or adding 4 APIs, right? It doesn't become about the number of APIs. It
Yeah.
becomes about whatever that business outcome was you were trying to enable. and I've said to my team many times, the true measure of success on a focus on business agility and a move toward it is when you have an EVP who's actually touting the benefits of it to the board, never using the word agile ever. Then you're probably doing it right, because they're excited about the agility and the ability to get to outcomes more flexibly, and has nothing to do with the methodology from their perspective.
I love that. It's a really nice litmus test.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a good reminder that the focus is not actually on the methodology, it's on what's enabling. So you use that word enablement or enabling several times over. It's critical. And I do know some folks who measure success in number of APIs they've implemented, and they hold that up. It's like, we have this many APIs. Like, well, are they actually doing what anyone needs them to do? Because quantity is not the issue.
That's right. Yeah, it was interesting. When I went through this the first time, I was with a company that was a big believer in go and sees, which was great. So they encouraged us inside the organization to find other companies that were not competitors outside the industry who were doing something, and then really going and seeing it. And so we did a go and see with a major grocery store chain that had been using scaled agile for 5 years. And when we got done with the session and our questions were winding down and we were busy thanking them, the leader of the technology organization pulled me aside and said, I just have to ask you, how did you get your business partners to come with you to this meeting? And I said, because we're trying to, change the way that we respond to the market. That's why. So they cared. Yeah. And they said, you know what, we've been operating with scaled agile for 5 years, and the business still refuses to engage with us in a different way. So it was really eye-opening to me that, when it becomes about the method, then it's very easy for the business to just, say, that's fine, do whatever you want, and I'm going to be over here doing what I want. As long as you get me what I need when I think I need it, do whatever, do it however you'd like. And that's really, I think, where a lot of companies get, maybe don't see the promise of like real business agility.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, how can you get them, or how can you expect them to care? Are you engaging in their methodologies?
Right.
I mean, only to the extent that they need you for it, right? But they're not bringing you in to talk about anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So why would it be the other way? So it's focusing on what actually matters to them, and then they should be volunteering to engage. Hopefully.
Well, right. I mean, that's the first place that we tried this inside of CNA. It was a place where we said to the business leader, wouldn't it be nice if we could talk about what you're trying to get done in the market and figure out how do we invest in getting that done, and spend less time, and I'll worry about which systems we're updating and how do we keep your environment current, and how do I further enable what you're trying to do from a technology perspective, and you can pay more attention to, is what we're delivering actually allowing you to drive those things that you need to drive. And that's how I got them engaged, because it was like, great, if we can do that, that'd be fantastic. Let's try it.
Yeah. So I know this is a technology talk, and obviously your role as a CIO, but that advice is really extensible to other areas. So I think about compliance. You mentioned regulatory before in the blockchain piece, but often it's a similar dynamic where the business sees compliance as standing in the way, and we have to avoid them until the last minute and then try to work around them. What if you brought them in the beginning and they were aware of what you're trying to achieve strategically and for your business, and worked with you on that because you allowed them to? It's like, again, like that's a big message from the startups in the next book, is like they made that decision up front that compliance is going to be a strategic advantage, not that thing you try to get around as long as possible, and then only change course or stop if it's an absolute no, you can't. Well, what do you expect them to say at the last minute when they've had no insight into anything, help you find a path?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's totally right. I mean, we have an amazing chief compliance officer at CNA, actually, and I never thought I would utter that phrase as a technologist, right? But I mean, he's outstanding, and he's built an organization that is very much about enabling the business. We've hired a new chief information security officer in the last year, and he's the same. I think that most most modern, what I would, I hate the word support functions, but to some degree, I mean, I don't own a P&L. So at
Yep.
that point, I'm a support function. Really taking that mindset of, well, what is the business trying to get done? And how do I help them by bringing the mindset that I have and work with them to get it done, as opposed to, no, but I'm the X person. And so I get to be the gatekeeper, and that's my job, is to gatekeep, as
Yeah.
opposed to my job is to enable from the area of expertise that I have.
Yeah.
We have a newer internal audit leader, and she takes the same
That's
focus,
another
very
good.
much
Yeah.
about enablement.
Yeah. I mean, you're hitting on a few like CISO, internal audit, etc. Like these are it ultimately is a choice. Are those like I used to watch NYPD Blue and the internal affairs where they were the bad guys, the internal cops looking at cops, and it's like, are you treating them like that, or are you treating them like partners? And if you embrace them and bring them in, what can you enable?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
I wonder in the last couple of minutes what wisdom you have for technology leaders, but I think for business leaders to listen to as well about how to be more collaborative, because if there's anything we've learned is you cannot separate the two. And I think 2020, as hard as it was, also forced this idea that you can't just work the way you've worked. You can't keep bifurcating it. Technology, business, they are one and the same at this point, and it's not like everything's going to revert, at some point soon in the future when everything's okay again. It does take more collaboration going forward because the customers will demand it and your distribution partners will demand it. I mean, all those acquisitions we talked about, like that's collaboration of the old and the new, and the technology and the traditional, offline business as well.
hmm Yeah, I mean, some of it, this is not, radical advice, but it's things I think that are easy to forget. So one of them is, try to become part of the fabric of the business organization. So I have the privilege of being invited to the president of our business at their, just regular staff meetings.
Mm,
So you're hearing the regular ongoing conversation about what they're seeing in the market, what's going on with this distribution player that they're interacting with. There's this organization, what's going on with the line of business and profitability, and what are they seeing in the market and renewals and rate. It's much easier then, as you listen to it, to say, okay, what are our teams doing, and how are we helping move those things forward? So some of it, the collaboration, is just figuring out in easy, light ways, how do you become part of the fabric of the conversation, so you can bring it forward. Now, a lot of people in technology will say, well, that's fascinating, but I don't understand what they're talking about in some of those
yeah.
meetings. And that's not unusual. And there's nothing wrong with it, right? If you cross industry, if I went to telco tomorrow, I'd be in the same boat. But I don't know about you, but I have yet to ask a business partner a question about their business and have them say, I don't have time to explain that to you.
Yeah.
So it's as much about being curious and being interested. And if you don't know what something is, write it down and ask your own team, ask, a former colleague outside the industry, ask the questions and seek to understand it. It doesn't really consume that much time, and it makes a big difference in the way that people talk. And I
Yeah.
think the other thing is then use that as a platform to bring value. So I've seen a lot of people come from high tech organizations and believe that the value they bring into the organization is their detailed understanding of blockchain and data lakes and some of the things we talked about. And they pride themselves to some degree on the fact that the business doesn't understand what they're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
because to them, well, that means I'm bringing this totally differentiated thing. And to me, that's just backwards. You know, we should be looking at how do we take these things and make them real. So for example, I hear all the time, well, I'm having trouble getting my business partners to understand why I want to spend money moving into the cloud. Why should we move to the cloud? Well, that's because you're making it about the cloud.
Yeah.
If you've got an application that's got a ton of downtime and it's impacting their ability to execute renewals, it turns out if you said, hey, I would like to go make this investment with you to move something into the cloud because I can create a lot more stable environment there and you will have fewer of those outages. You're making it real. They don't need to
Yeah.
understand the cloud. They don't need to know everything about it. They can trust you that you know it. but being able to really speak the language,
Yeah.
that's the other critical one. And then I'm very blessed to have a number of people in the business that I work with regularly, and at my last company as well, who actually are interested in technology, right? They want to learn, they want to understand it, and so I try my best to bring
Yeah.
forward things to them that are helpful to them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great advice, and it does sound like you have a good ecosystem of peers and partners around you at CNA. And I know not everyone gets to claim that, so it's a nice thing when you have it. But it's also, I mean, your message is it's on you then to build that and to
Right.
partner as much as you can and to be curious and be interested and think about that enabling what the business is trying to achieve. So if
Mhm.
it's not the attitude or the culture that you have at the moment, empower yourself to change it as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, when I came to CNA, I would argue I didn't have the ecosystem I just described. A lot of
Yeah.
that has been people that were there and willing and interested, and in some cases less so. And it's really about, how you take the organization forward. And that's why I always say I really think that CIOs, insurance or otherwise, just really have a unique opportunity to make an impact inside an organization, because you say tech is part of the fabric of the business, and that's true. But if it's not the way people talk to each other, and it's not the
Yeah.
way they think about things, and it's not the way they solution or find answers,
Yeah.
then, yes, that's the way it should be. But if it's not, there's nothing to be done about it. But the CIO is the one I think that can really make an impact
Yeah.
on changing that dynamic.
Yeah. Oh, that's well said. Jane's brilliant, really valuable insights, and great to hear. If nothing else, that blockchain is real and it's actually starting to take hold. So that was, I think we all waited like 5 years through the conference scene of hearing about it enough. So it's good to hear it's going somewhere. Thank you so much for the ideas and for your time once again. You've always been such a good support. So thank you for that.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Brian. I always enjoy our conversations. This was great. Thank you so much for
Thanks,
having
Jane.
me.
It's great. Thank you to Jane for coming on the show and sharing some thoughts. Really interesting, I thought, the discussion around blockchain in particular and how it could help democratize data, free it up to move between organizations, between people in a safe and secure way. It's not something I'd really thought about with blockchain before, but she's got my wheels turning. I hope she has for you as well. So thank you to Jane and to CNA for her appearance today. Thank you to Medallia for making this episode possible. And as a reminder, you can pick up The Future of Insurance, both books, Volume 1, Legacy Carriers, which includes CNA, and Volume 2, The Startups, at future-of-insurance.com or at amazon.com in your favorite format, whether that's print or digital, be it Kindle or Audible. You can get those today. So hopefully all of this conversation is interesting to you and you want to dig deeper. You want to go through the books. You want to share the show with people you care about in the industry, and you will subscribe so you can catch future episodes from great executives and thought leaders like Jane Possell and others. So with that, I will leave you to go do all those things I just told you about, subscribing and getting the book and all that good stuff. And do share the show. That really does mean a lot. Let's help spread the message of change and adaptation and growth and standing by our customers throughout the industry. So with that, goodbye, everyone, and I will talk to you next time.